Has the historical narrative become a man of straw, constantly being pulled at, exaggerating how enormous and increasingly brittle the pieces are, being pulled out to be put on display, getting reinforcement from the onlookers who merely parrot and chant as the straw is extracted and examined? It is stretched and skewed. It becomes malleable and easily breaks under the pressure. Now it is ridiculed for being weak and simple in composition. Only a fool would think this straw man had any substance to begin with. The old saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. These words are then turned into statements, which blend into paragraphs, then stories and narratives of their own, employing those as authors who repurpose the images to fit a specific bent or even ideology. Are we taking a mute witness of history and applying a vague facade of mystery to provide explanation, pushing aside history as his story and propping up alternative ideas with imaginative theories? In order to properly explore any further into this exposition series, it should be done more honestly and thoroughly, as I have spent many episodes applying various levels of scrutiny towards historical documentation, trying, in a sense, to prove it false or incorrect, essentially doing a disservice to myself and those watching. So let's explore the difference between the man of straw and man of steel. With that, we explore one of the most fascinating documents I have come across in relation to this exposition. I would like to point out that these documents were mentioned in a comment, which then led to the making of this very episode. A small example of how this research is community-based. These documents are a series of publications created by the French representatives that attended the exposition. They are a technical review of the event, recording copious amounts of notes, some of which we will explore as they touch on various aspects throughout the exposition. One of the most intriguing sentiments presented, even in the initial foreword, is that this event was indeed a great accomplishment, but even the event itself cannot overshadow the pathetic attempt at architectural copy. For these representatives leave no remorse in telling what they saw and recorded, and their recordings are more detailed in many ways than what is published in the American books, many of which we have previously explored. This is an incredible insight into another country's perception of this mysterious event, an insight that may shift your perspective. My skepticisms could have been misplaced. I may have been wrong. This episode is sure to ruffle some feathers. Let's begin. So let's start this presentation at the beginning. We will read through the foreword of this first volume, translated from French as Architecture and Steel Construction at the Chicago Exposition, Part 1. Now, what I've done is simply isolate each page, then put it through Google Translate, and then we will read the results. The original page in French will be beside for comparison. If there are any out there who are fluent in both English and French, they can compare notes in real time, simultaneously. You may also do this yourself, as the link to these documents will be below. So take consideration of what is said about this event and how it is portrayed. This is a completely different perspective from another visiting country at the exposition. We read. It is a proven fact that, apart from any financial considerations, the Columbian Exposition was a great scientific and industrial success. The Chicago Exposition, said Mr. Camille Krantz, can be considered a very great success, in the sense that exhibitors came from all over the world, and then they contributed a very brilliant contribution. To enumerate the most outstanding qualities of the Chicago Exposition is difficult. Nevertheless, it is necessary to cite, among other things, the exhibition of means of transport, the mining section, the palaces of electricity, machines, ethnography, and fisheries. There is, in all these special exhibitions, an effort and a display of intelligence. The impression one gets is a feeling of great admiration for this research in the specialities, and we are convinced that there are subjects for study that are useful for each of the branches of commerce in question and industry. Mr. Camille Krantz, in his capacity as Commissioner General of the French government at the Columbian Exposition, was particularly able to examine in depth all the questions relating to science, arts, and industry. The opinion of a man whose authority in such matters is incontestable. The unanimously favored assessments of all the people who have studied and judged the Chicago Exposition from the point of view technical affirm all the interest that this exhibition offered for engineers, architects, and industrialists. From this point of view, the Chicago Exposition is a rich mine to be exploited. Information of all kinds abounds here. We have proposed to collect that which relates to new principles, to the new application of known principles, to the most recent and most ingenious modes of construction, manufacture, and exploitation, to the processes allowing to realize a greater economy and a greater perfection in the work. To this end, we have been keen to collect, either directly or through collaborators combining recognized competence with indisputable authority, not only the information that could be found at the exposition, but also that which it was necessary to obtain from the factories themselves to complete the first. Furthermore, among the works presented at the congresses of the Columbian Exposition, several deserve to be noted. We believed it necessary to submit to the appreciation of the readers of our work those of the reports which present the greatest interest by their great scientific and industrial scope. Our only wish is that the task we have undertaken will be useful to the engineers, architects, and industrialists for whom our work is intended. To what extent have we succeeded? The many sympathies and encouragements we have received can lead us to hope that the work thus undertaken and conducted will not be sterile. We say elsewhere, who were the collaborators who were kind enough to take charge of this or that chapter, that their special competence put them particularly in a position to deal with knowledge of the facts. We pray all those who have been kind enough to give us their support, in many cases so necessary, always so precious, to receive here the legitimate homage of our very sincere gratitude. So just an interesting note here before continuing on, that this was an important event for these representatives in terms of gathering intel, a wealth of knowledge for engineers, architects, and industrialists. We have mention of exploitation, which can lead towards the potential copy of advanced principles or applications. Maybe it was also the direct exploitation of any machinery used in warfare or infrastructure. Just something to think about as we read along. Let's continue. General considerations on the Columbian Exposition. Before entering upon the study of purely technical questions, we felt it necessary to deal very briefly with some subjects of more general interest, and intended to enable the reader to compare the Chicago Exhibition with previous exhibitions, to know briefly its beginnings, to have an overview of its whole and its multiple divisions. The Chicago Exposition compared to previous expositions. Which country has the honor of holding the first public exhibition of artistic, industrial, and commercial life? What was the first attempt at an exhibition? It took place at the end of the last century in 1798, when the young French Republic was taking off and seeking to assert its legitimacy by reviving all branches of commerce and industry. It was François de Neufchâteau, then Minister of the Interior, to give a new splendor to the Directory celebrations, grouped all the national industries in a place which was decorated with a name borrowed from pagan Rome. the Temple of Industry. There were exhibitors who, for 13 days, attracted many visitors. This experiment has been repeated several times since then, always with the same success, but these attempts, which took place in each country in isolation, were necessarily limited in scope. It was then understood that there could be an interest for each nation in comparing its products and its working methods with those of foreign powers. The first World's Fair was born from this idea. It took place in London in 1851. All those that have followed since have had a special cachet, but all have also had this common characteristic of seeking to do better and bigger than those that had preceded them. In this respect, the Chicago Exposition followed the general rule. What characterizes it is the immensity of its grounds, its buildings, the variety and multitude of products it offers to the eyes, the unusual deployment of all the means of production, transformation, and use currently known. Finally, some innovations due to the American genius, such as the Administrative Services Building, the Women's Building and Exhibition, etc. To better bring out these particular characteristics of the American Exposition, we will recall in a few words the essential points of the previous expositions. It was in 1851 that the Queen of England and the Prince Consort inaugurated the first World's Fair, which took place in London and whose main attraction was the famous Crystal Palace, designed and built by Mr. J. Paxton. It was the starting point of all the great exhibition halls, which led to the French Machinery Gallery of 1889 and to the Palace of Manufactures in Chicago. In London, each country was represented separately and administered specially while contributing to the overall effect. During the 5 months that this exhibition lasted, it opened its doors to 6 million visitors, and the cash turnover exceeded 2 million. The practical genius of England was admired by all, as well as the magnificence with which she distributed the rewards to the exhibitors. 2 years later, the first American World's Fair took place in New York. Its character was to be exclusively commercial and industrial. The first great French exhibition opened in Paris on 15 of May, 1855, in the Palais de l'Industrie, or the Palace of Industry, built for the occasion. It also included the Pavilion du Panorama and a series of galleries located on Quai de Billy and Avenue d'Antin for industry, Avenue Montaigne for the Beaux-Arts, not to mention a host of other buildings. It was not only an industrial exhibition as in London, it also gave shelter to the Beaux-Arts, which were widely represented there and admired for 6 months by more than 6 million visitors. The Palace of Industry, which since 1855 has served as a venue for a series of local artistic and industrial exhibitions, was in 1867 deemed insufficient for a new exhibition. The second Universal Exhibition of Paris was therefore inaugurated at the Champ de Mars on April 1, 1867. Around a central garden were 7 concentric galleries forming an immense ellipse, which was cut transversely by 16 streets. Everything was thus perfectly divided by country and by speciality, and of the easiest access. The various industries and fine arts were even more widely represented there than in 1855. Among other things, people admired the Gallery of the History of Work, which showed the transformation of raw materials according to different areas. One of the concerns of the organizers of the 1867 exhibition was to group and highlight teaching and educational methods, as well as social studies. 30 million visitors came from all over, including 3 foreign emperors, 14 kings and queens, and a large number of princes and princesses from the first reigning families of Europe. 5 years before, the capital of England had also inaugurated a second general exhibition, and 6 years later, in 1873, the capital of Austria followed suit. The main feature of this last exhibition was the development given to the mechanical and industrial part. The dimensions and the interior organization of the Palace of Machines were unprecedented. In 1876, America, wishing to celebrate the centenary of the proclamation of its independence, opened in Philadelphia a universal exhibition in which all departments of the government were represented. Here we find the seeds of the ideas that presided over the current Chicago Exposition: the central building, the Palace of Machines, palaces of fine arts, halls of horticulture and agriculture, etc. The number of admissions during the 6 months of the exhibition exceeded 1 million, and the revenue reached almost $4 million. The Third Universal Exhibition in Paris, decreed on April 4, 1876, and opened on May 1, 1878. The left bank of the Seine at the Champ de Mars was occupied on this occasion by a series of covered galleries, and the right bank was transformed into gardens, terraces, fountains, and waterfalls framed by the Palace de Trocadero. The special architecture of an exhibition was more assertive. The galleries of the Champ de Mars were made of iron with brick and glass filling and domes at the corners. The facade of the statues of the various nations was much admired. As for the Palace de Trocadero, which has remained standing, it does honor to the two architects who executed it, Mr. Daviod and Bordes, by the simplicity of its arrangements and the speed of its execution. More than 40 million visitors walked through the galleries, palaces, and gardens, and marveled at the effort made to provide shelter for the 5,300 exhibitors. The last Paris exhibition took place in 1889. As soon as it was resolved on November 8, 1884, a competition was opened in which the first French architects and engineers took part. Garnier, Contamin, Bouvard, Duterre, Formigé, and Eiffel. Mr. Alphand took over the general management of the works, and Mr. Georges Berger that of the operation. Just don't mind my French pronunciation. I tried, I butchered it. We're moving on. France was certainly, in the ancient world, the nation most capable of bringing together so many diverse works in monuments of such a different and always so attractive character. It is enough to recall the Gallery of Machines, the domes of fine arts and liberal arts, the central dome, the numerous iron galleries of such light construction, the original constructions forming the history of human habitation, and the 300-meter tower, not to mention the multiple attractions at the Champ de Mars, the Esplanade des Invalides, and the Trocadero. During the 6 months that this exposition lasted, from May 8th to November 10th, 1889, it opened its doors to 28 million visitors, and the revenue exceeded 28 million francs. What place will the Chicago Exposition now hold in the annals of history? It is difficult to say at present, but a general impression is given of this considerable accumulation of grandiose buildings, powerful machines, and products of all kinds brought together and concentrated in a few months on the shores of Lake Michigan, in a place which, until a short time ago, was almost a desert. We borrow from the excellent report made from Mr. Oh, 3 last names? Man, really testing me here. Mr. de Chaz-Saloup-Labat, to the Society of Civil Engineers, the following general overview which gives a good account of this general impression. What is most striking when one arrives at Jackson Park is the complete absence of an overall plan. The various buildings have no visible correlation between them, and do not even appear to be part of the same whole. Involuntarily, the thought returns to the banks of the Seine and to the regularity of the plan executed in 1889 at the Trocadero and the Champ de Mars. One cannot help comparing the two exhibitions and finding that they symbolize the very different genius of the two races. Like France itself, the French exhibition was compact, symmetrical, and built according to the rigid and majestic order of a general plan, conceived in advance. Nearly a third of the total surface was covered, and in the middle of the old city, which on all sides enveloped them with its houses, the vast metal naves were pressed against each other, as men in harvests are on our too narrow soil. The exhibition of 1889, where the general views had been so skillfully arranged, was striking by the majesty and symmetry of the whole. Even more than the finish and perfection of the details, it was the work of an ancient race and an ancient soil which had made each other. By the continuous work of past generations, it was the creation of a nation having that certainty and absoluteness of artistic conceptions which can only be given to the long traditions of a civilization slowly formed by the centuries that have passed. It was finally the type of a debatable ideal, but of an ideal proceeding from certain preconceived and invariable principles, just as French society rests on the absolute legislative ideal which it has, for its good or for its ills, received from the laws of Rome and the Revolution. The exhibition of 1889 well characterized the France of today. The smallness of the territory relative to the population, and consequently the complete use of the land, the uniformity of legislation and regulations, the omnipotence of the state in the face of the isolated individual following the numerous political upheavals which violently tore from the old French society the social organisms which attached man, to the field and to the workshop. Finally, the safety and assurance of the aesthetic idea, fruits of ancient European civilizations and of the refined taste that a long artistic education and classical traditions brought to Gaul, via the Rhone basin, from the shores of the Mediterranean, have put into the race. Like the United States itself, the American Exposition is gigantic and is not built according to a rigid and uniform overall plan. On the contrary, the overall plan leaves so much room for the will of each that it is hardly visible and that one would often be tempted to deny its existence. Such is, in our day, the great American Republic. When one travels through the various parts of the Union, one forgets at times the flexible but strong ties which unite them. That is to say, the federal laws. So insignificant do these federal laws seem when one sees, on the other hand, the profound material and moral dissimilarities which distinguish between them the different states of the Republic. It is because these different states are so entirely independent, so completely free to govern and administer themselves as they please, that they often have civil and political legislations so different from one another that they sometimes offer such dissimilarities as distinct climates, productions, customs, religions, and populations, and except for the question of language, sometimes having little more resemblance between them than many European nations. From certain points of view, the present United States constitute a gathering of peoples rather than a single people, just as the builders of Jackson Park constitute a gathering of exhibitions rather than a single exhibition. The Chicago Exposition is not compact, but very spread out. Less than a quarter of the total surface is covered. It is not in the middle of a city that the vast metal roofs of the American palaces stand, but in an immense prairie crossed to the southwest by the gigantic Mississippi and bordered to the north by the colossal lake system of the St. Lawrence, whose surface area reaches about half that of the whole of France. American soil is not yet encumbered with men, and one finds there even today vast spaces entirely deserted. The decoration of the buildings of the 1893 Exposition is generally rather unfortunate, and one can say that it most often lacks this principal quality, style. The American architects have, in fact, copied the best-known styles of antiquity and seem to have forgotten the intimate correlation and harmony which must necessarily exist between the types of decoration and the materials used. They seem not to have realized that one cannot make a work of art by copying with iron and brick the pure contours of the Greek temples built with blocks of white marble, the powerful Roman archers built in concrete, the dentils which the Arabs have excavated in plaster and which the masters of the Middle Ages have chiseled in granite. In 1889, the French did not seek to copy the Greeks, the Romans, and the Arabs, any more than those of their ancestors to whom they owe their cathedrals, but they created a style, that is to say, a mode of decoration in harmony with the materials used. One could say all one wanted about this style. One could criticize it or admire it, think that it was very ugly or very beautiful, see it in a failed attempt or a new path, but one was forced to recognize that it existed by itself, which is the first of the necessary conditions for any work of art. In 1893, the Americans limited themselves to copying the decorations of admirable monuments which are the glory of past centuries, and could only copy them badly, since they did not use the same construction materials used by those who created the models. Let's just read that again. This is incredible. In 1893, the Americans limited themselves to copying the decorations of the admirable monuments which are the glory of past centuries, and could only copy them badly, since they did not use the same construction materials used by those who created the models. Well, damn. I told you this would ruffle some feathers, stating that these buildings at the Columbian Exposition are mere copies. They are not like those of Greece. They are not those of Rome, and certainly not those of which the Arabs have excavated in the Middle East. Not only are these just copies, but they are copied badly. The facades are not only that, facades, but they are poorly done. Let's read on and see what else Mr. Krantz has written for his fellow countrymen. It is all the more unfortunate to have to note this American self-confidence that they have truly created beautiful and original works in these metal frames, where certainly resides the true beauty of the buildings of the Jackson Park Exposition, a beauty made of boldness, audacity, lightness, purity of lines, and a profound general harmony resulting from a perfect use of materials. So, there is beauty here, boldness, purity of lines, and general harmony, but it is more in the steelwork, the bones of the structures, that impresses Mr. Krantz and his fellow writers. Very interesting. Moreover, what we see in Chicago should not surprise us. America is still too young, and the flow of European immigration to the soil of the United States is too intense for the Americans to have been able to conceive and execute a national art in harmony with their climate, their customs, and their materials. The various European elements have not yet entirely fused together, principally in the West, to constitute human types characterized above all by their social positions and the climates in which they live. The different artistic nations received from Europe are not yet grouped and crystallized into one or even several conceptions of ideal in the arts. In Chicago, one recognizes without difficulty, under the deceptive uniformity of the active American city, not only the different races, but also the different modes of thought. Time has not yet sufficiently accomplished its great work of fusion between men and ideas. The Chicago Exposition thus well characterizes the United States of today, the immensity of the territory relative to the population, and, consequently, the incomplete use of the land, the dissimilarities in the legislations and regulation as well as in the climates and productions of the various states, the weakness of the federal state in the face of these powerful associations of workers, capitalists, and believers who have created the unheard-of prosperity of modern America by tending to make the human machine, constantly stimulated by individual energy and will stretched to the limit, produce a yield unknown anywhere else. Finally, a floating and undecided aesthetic taste, because the American social body, still in the fever of growth and development, has not had the time and leisure to melt together by assimilating them, the chaos of ethnic elements and artistic notions thrown pell-mell by European ships into this new world so different from the old continents. It is this retrospective comparison between the work of 1889 and that of 1893 which will perhaps constitute one of the most lively interests of the Chicago Exhibition. Some killjoys have concluded from the above reflections that the Chicago Exposition was a failed work and that there was nothing to be found there. A more thorough study of the question would have led them to a very different conclusion. From the fact that a young and active people hastily conceived and executed a plan open to criticism in the eyes of experienced professionals, it does not follow that their work is devoid of interest. The Chicago Exposition offers precisely this particular characteristic, that not very attractive at first, it attracts more and more the ones who seek to examine it more closely. The superficial observer finds only a mediocre interest in it. The competent researcher, on the contrary, becomes fascinated the more he studies it in a more thorough manner. What an incredible foreword indeed. We have a clear and concise indication that the buildings that were represented at the Columbian Exposition were merely bad copies, coming from an individual trained in technical minutiae. His main objective was to document this event down to the smallest detail, some of which we will examine later in this episode. Was it not interesting that Mr. Krantz was more intrigued by the metalwork from which the interiors were created, even how the event seemed to be a mixture of styles? There was harmony stated, yet the mention of America still being too young was a bold perspective, for the Americans have not fused together as a country to create a more unified and cohesive harmony of artistic expression. They may not have a true national identity, with so many mixed cultures, modes, methods, and ideas. Therefore, they simply copy what has been done, and copy it badly. It also appears that other researchers or writers, or killjoys, as it was written, stated that this exposition was essentially a dud. These were most likely international writers. It's hard to be 100% accurate on that, or potentially representatives from other countries. There was nothing of interest here, a failed work. The French representatives do feel a bit differently and feel there is something of substance here, something beneath the surface, or beneath that badly copied facade. However, it's such a jarring contrast to the reaction of this exposition to many of those researching it, including myself. Yes, these buildings look impressive, and they are indeed grand in stature, but it seems the French are stating that these structures are akin to the old saying, good from far, but far from good. This is truly a revealing perspective. However, this isn't really stating anything different from what we have researched on the channel, and those watching the series should recognize that. Despite my skepticism, the research has shown that these structures do seem to be built from the materials mentioned. Episode 4, Staff or Stone, dives into this aspect extensively. This is also echoed in many American publications, journals, newspaper articles, publications from the time, and in almost all the construction images available. One major discrepancy, however, is in Campbell's Illustrated History, where we have the initial plan stating that the main buildings may be constructed of more durable materials. Strange, yes. However, these statements haven't been repeated in other sources that have investigated. Maybe this is an example of an outlier, and could be attributed to ambitious tendencies of the financiers. We will explore materials in another upcoming episode. Explanations, types of materials, machinery used to manufacture them, and companies associated with these materials. That will include anything from staff, stucco, scagliola, plaster, and all forms of masonry, bricks, concreting, freestone, and of course cast stone or manufactured stone. That will be a shock to many researching this topic, as it also goes against many alternative theories. This next section is quite long and would like to read the entire chapter for context. Mr. Krantz discusses the beginnings of the exposition. Again, this is coming from a completely different perspective, as an observer, cataloging this event in its entirety. We read. Part 1. Architecture at the Chicago Exhibition. The Columbian Exposition, the idea of which dates back to 1876, was decided on April 9, 1890, and on the 25th of the same month, Congress voted the bill awarding Chicago the honor of this great enterprise. On the 1st of June following, Jackson Park and Lake Michigan opposite Chicago were selected as the site of the exposition. On the 20th of August, Messrs. F.L. Olmsted and Company were appointed consulting architects for the parks and gardens. Between that time and the following December, the organization of the building department was completely by the appointment of Mr. D.J. Burnham as chief and Mr. J.W. Root as consulting architect. Mr. Burnham having already taken an active part in the preparation of the undertaking, it is to his sagacity, his energy, his breadth of vision, as well as his great experience in architecture, that the Chicago Commission is indebted, in large part for the amount of effective work which has been intelligently carried out therein. Under his powerful impulse, the organization of the administration of parks and buildings was ably established. It is up to the Parks and Construction Committee, assisted by the advice of the former designated persons, that the consideration of this important question of the choice of a site fell to them. It was necessary to discover in the interior of Chicago, or in its immediate vicinity, an area of land capable of easily containing buildings which, taken as a whole, would be at least 50% larger than those of the last Paris Exposition. They must easily and be economically accessible to visitors and to the material to be exhibited, not divided by railroads, streets, or waterways. Finally, the area chosen must not be encumbered by houses or other buildings, which would have made its acquisition and development difficult for the construction of the buildings of the exposition. The few sites which met these requirements were all flat, low, and of an unsatisfactory and unpicturesque appearance. Within a radius of several miles from the city, the only large, pleasant spot, and one which offered facilities worthy of the staging of a great exposition, was on the shores of Lake Michigan. Only one site on its banks met the desired conditions. It was a space of 500 acres, situated 4 miles south of the central part of the city, occupying a length of 1.5 miles on the shores of the lake and having a width of 1,200 yards, or about 4 times the area of our World's Fair in 1889. The ground consisted of a series of sand dunes, which the waters had successfully thrown up in lines nearly parallel to the shore, the most considerable of them not having an average height of more than 2 meters above the high water of the lake. Between these dunes were situated extensive marshy lowlands, subject to accidental flooding, and where the water was generally found standing a foot or 2 below the surface. Some of the dunes were furnished with clumps of stunted oaks, and the intervening lowlands were somewhat covered with jones and aquatic grasses. This land belonged to the South Park Commission, which had acquired it 20 years previously with a view to transforming it into a public park. In reality, it was still fallow, as we have already said, with the exception of a strip of land at its northern end, which had been leveled, planted, transformed by ponds and made accessible by means of avenues and walks. The disadvantages of this location were evident. but it was considered that the inconvenience resulting from its distance from the populous parts of the city was compensated, on the other hand, by the following advantages. First, the ground was absolutely bare. Second, it could be made easily accessible either by a boat service on the lake or by public means of transport of various kinds, without there being any need to create railway lines or to build many bridges or viaducts. Third, a large number of railways passed within a radius of a few hundred meters around the boundaries of the land, heading on one side towards the heart of the city. On the other side, they were connected, or could easily be connected, with lines from all parts of the continent. In truth, the appearance of this uncultivated desert presented many obstacles to the realization of the horticultural splendors of the parks and gardens, which had characterized the previous international exhibitions. The imagination of landscape architects, however, perceived the possibility of drawing from these unattractive elements quite extraordinary effects of an entirely appropriate character. The vast expanse of the great inland lake itself, with its continually changing surface and oceanic horizon, its waters covered with sails and animated by the incessant movement of steamers and ships of various kinds, beneath a limitless sky, would give to the setting a particularly novel character. Under this influence, the visitor could forget the bushy and shady parks that could not be obtained here. Steam dredges and leveling machines could quickly and cheaply enlarge the upland area, creating plateaus and imposing terraces to support the great palaces of the exhibition, while excavators would transform the marshy intervals into a system of lagoons connected with the lake by canals and basins. In this way, a system of internal canals 6 kilometers long could be created, which would be crossed by boat omnibuses, transporting visitors from each part of the park to the landing stages located in front of each of the main buildings. These considerations led the landscape architects to recommend to the Parks and Buildings Committee the adoption of the land known as Jackson Park. After much negotiation with the South Park Commission and much controversy with the proponents of other sites, the above lands were finally granted on condition that after the exposure and removal of the buildings, they should be left in such condition as to form a permanent public park for the whole city. So let's just read that again. This is an important note here. The above lands were finally granted on condition that after the exposure and removal of the buildings, they should be left in such condition as to form a permanent public park for the whole city. Well, this is a new detail for me. I was unaware that this was agreed upon to have the buildings removed after the event, this agreement coming before the construction began. So this land belonged to the South Park Commission, acquiring it 20 years earlier. The northern part had been leveled, planted, and transformed, while the idea was to revamp the entire region into a public park. This can actually be cross-referenced with Olmsted's blueprints or plans of the grounds in the 1890s, which show these details quite clearly. Let's continue on. A series of ingenious plans were then prepared and presented to the committee by the authors. The considerations which had to guide the architects in the establishment of an overall plan were numerous and varied. We can cite the following. To find such an arrangement of the principal palaces, that the best possible use was made of the natural conditions of the terrain, modified, however, and corrected by the skill of the landscape architects, to give all these buildings their own distinct means of communication, linking them to each other and to the park's canal system. Arrange these palaces at points where their large dimensions and mutual proximity were necessary, to take advantage of a grouping of palaces to bring out a majestic architecture, or, on the contrary, to preserve a picturesque and accidental character where the conditions of the landscape were such that they seemed to prohibit a strict observation of classical types. All these arrangements were subordinate to the particular situation provided by the vast expanse of the site and the receding horizon of the lake. Another essential condition affecting the general provisions of the plan related to the means of communication, it was necessary to serve the park by the 7 railways, as well as to disembark and embark 60,000 people per hour without the least confusion, and this at such a point that each visitor, on entering the enclosure of the exposition, would be struck at once by the grandiose and splendid spectacle, surprising at the same time by the arrangement of its architecture and its natural elements. It was also necessary to consider means of transport by tramways and by water, the latter requiring the construction of piers and ports on the shores of the lake, as well as the creation of internal communication routes in the form of aerial tramways. None of these difficulties were insurmountable. The greatest of them was undoubtedly the transformation into gardens of a stretch of land which had hitherto been uncultivated. The special points that were to receive the large monumental constructions of the exhibition were to be enhanced by terraces with decorative balustrades, statues, fountains, lakes, streams, bridges, and footbridges. This architectural and sculptural ensemble would be arranged in the middle of picturesque and lively vegetation. Unlike the appearance of previous exhibition sites located in the heart of ancient civilizations, the prairies of Illinois offered none of these precisely reserves of trees and plantations by means of which the capitals of Europe can, in a short time, transform an exhibition site. The climate of this part of America is not very suitable for vegetation. When the thick ice that forms on Lake Michigan during the winter breaks up, it is pushed up by the prevailing north wind toward Chicago, where it remains and delays the start of spring. At this time, and while the first leaves are developing, a night breeze from Canada sweeps over this expanse of icy water of 800 kilometers, so that all species of vegetation growing on the southern shore of the lake is completely destroyed. Moreover, the fluctuations of the waters of the lake, not only those of each day, but also those of its normal and average level during the summer, have the effect of creating sad and bare shores. It was decided that the puny clumps of existing trees should be hidden by a plantation of native shrubs around the lake, so as to produce from a distance the illusion of a compact mass of foliage. So again, just a quick note, I'm reading this as it was translated, and there will be points instances like this in the first sentence where we have the puny and puny as words are doubled up. It's just the nature of the translation, and apologize. Again, that's why I'm including the French on the other side, so it can be compared in real time, should you decide to do it yourself. Let's read on. It was decided, again, that the bank should be lined with reeds and aquatic plants, which would withstand the accidental flooding of the lake, that the ground behind should be furnished with shrubs, notably with willows and native flowering vegetation. Well-kept lawns should be laid out wherever it was necessary to enhance the wild aspect of the land. At first, the Parks and Buildings Committee, in concert with Mr. Burnham, the chief of buildings, had to deal with a delicate question. How were the plans for these great buildings to be drawn up? Should an architect be appointed for the whole or for each palace? Should these architects be chosen by competition, a limited competition, or by direct choice? After a careful examination of the question, it was resolved by the committee, in accordance with the considerations contained in a report presented by the consulting architects, to give as much as possible to the architectural part of the exhibition a national character, by making a direct choice of architects, thus avoiding the delays and embarrassment which would have inevitably accompanied any other form of appointment. At the same time, these talented artists and builders were called upon to consider the architectural questions of the exhibition as a whole, effectively through harmonious cooperation. On June 12, 1891, the appointed architects, Mr. R.M. Hunt, George B. Post, Mack Kim, Mead and White of New York, Peabody and Stearns of Boston, Van Brunt and Howe of Kansas City, and Mr. Adler and Sullivan, S.S. Beeman, Henry Ives Cobb, W.L.B. Jenny, Burling and Whitehouse of Chicago were called to confer with the chief of construction, the consulting architect, Mr. Frederick Law Olmsted, and his assistant, Mr. Henry Sargent Codman of Boston, on the architectural considerations involved in the general plan of the exposition. The plans drawn up by the consulting architect and by the landscape architects, plans which in their entirety had already been approved by the National Commission and by the directors of Chicago, were submitted to the examination of this meeting of architects. After a careful discussion of the general plan, in the course of which many more or less fundamental modifications were suggested, it was decided to propose to the Committee on Parks and Buildings the adoption of the general plan, as drawn up by Mr. Root, Olmsted, and Codman, with a few changes. In fact, the problem had been handled by these engineers with skill and with an exact anticipation of all the conditions embraced and necessitated by this great enterprise. It will be noted that the plan has three major divisions. The northern part, already transformed into a park by the city, is occupied in the center by the Fine Arts Department. The state pavilions are grouped on the north and west sides, the foreign pavilions being placed partly on the east and partly in Midway Plaisance, a large reserved lot 200 yards wide between 59th and 60th Streets, forming an avenue ending on the west of Jackson Park. On this site are reserved concessions for various enterprises and operations, such as villages, groups of pavilions showing the characteristics of domestic and industrial life in various countries, fairground establishments, entertainments similar to those found in the Rue de Caire at Paris exhibition in 1889. The central part is formed by the lagoons, characteristic of the landscape. It is an artificial watercourse winding through this part of the land around the islands that emerge from it. The largest of these islands is about 560 meters long and 70 to 160 meters wide. Its banks are lined with aquatic plants and enhanced with flower baskets with kiosks and rustic pavilions as they approach the bridges. A part of the northern extremity of this island has been reserved and granted to Japan, which has established a garden there in accordance with the ancient traditions of Japanese art, and which has embellished it with exact reproductions of several of its most venerable temples. The other banks of the lagoons are occupied by the Palace of Transport, by Palace of Horticulture and its gardens, and by Palace of Women to the east. Towards the lake stand the Palace of Manufactures, that of Liberal Arts, and the pavilions of the United States. Bathed by the past of the lagoons capriciously directed towards the east, we find the Palace of Fine Arts, the Palace of the State of Illinois, the Palaces of Fisheries and the Government of the United States towards the south. The irregular curved quadrilateral is closed by the north facades of the Palace of Mines and Electricity. The lagoons are connected to the south by a system of canals and basins, symmetrically placed in relation to the large square, or main courtyard of the exhibition. This square is a regular rectangle of 650 meters in length by 230 meters in width. It is approximately equal to that of the last Paris exhibition, where the luminous fountains were placed. Water communications are installed at the eastern end of this courtyard, and the railway system opens at the western end in a terminus station, hidden by the Palace of Administration, which offers the appearance of a monumental gate surmounted by a dome. From the terminus station, visitors can pass under the large semicircular bays of this portal. To the right of the Palace of Administration, we find the Palace of Machines and that of Agriculture. To the left, those of Mines, Electricity, and that of Manufactures and Liberal Arts, located directly opposite Lake Michigan. The center of the courtyard is occupied by a large artificial basin, which forms part of the hydraulic system of the exhibition. Relic with this basin, a wide canal bordered by double terraces and crossed by various bridges, flows towards the south in a small square separating the Palace of Agriculture from the Palace of Machines. This courtyard is closed to the south by a colonnade, the central part of which is characterized by a triumphal arch, under which visitors pass, to reach the food department, which limits the exposure to the south. A canal symmetrical to the previous one and of similar dimensions is placed on the same axis and flows between the Palace of Electricity and that of Liberal Arts. It communicates, as we have already seen, with the lagoons. This description, accompanied by the photographic views that we present, can give, in broad outline, an idea of the general plan of the exhibition. Next, we will read through some sections regarding the construction, the foundations of the palaces, and the acquisition of metalwork used within the structures themselves. Again, taking notes of the finer details, the measurements, and the statements. Construction at the Chicago Exposition. The Chicago Exposition palaces, considered solely from the point of view of their construction, denote great experience on the part of the American nation. Their frames are well designed and well studied. The large-scale metal or nixed frames of their buildings highlight the building talent of their architects. All the arrangements are logical. The Palace of Mines, among others, presents in its framework provisions which until then had not been practiced in the construction of buildings. The structure of the trusses constituting the building was inspired by that of large metal bridges with a deck balanced on piers, the pillars of the trusses integral with the central part of the roof and comparable to immense balanced consoles. In addition, the entire metal part of the trusses is formed of panels whose uprights and diagonals are articulated at their ends. Furthermore, as American manufacturers make extensive use of graphic statics to determine the extension or compression efforts acting in the members and trusses making up their constructions, this creation of articulated systems is in absolute agreement with the hypotheses adopted in the calculations. The palaces of the administration, of manufactures and liberal arts, of grandiose dimensions, have structures of remarkable lightness. In these frames, heavy members with solid cores have been avoided and replaced by hollow cores in lattice. So here again, we have another example of how the framework of these buildings is the true masterpiece behind the structure, going into some detail about how the Palace of Mines presents a novel style of construction not seen before, stating that these articulated systems of metalworks are in absolute agreement with adopted calculations. It's simply incredible to hear almost the opposite perspective as what is published in American articles. We can see the inner workings of these foundations in some of the illustrative works that accompany these volumes. They will also be posted on the channel after this episode premieres, and would encourage anyone interested to go download the visual atlas along with the written works. Let's continue on. Nature of the foundations of the exhibition palaces. We have seen previously that the lands of Jackson Park were made up of a series of sand dunes and marshy lowlands. The level of the unsubmerged ground varied from 15 centimeters to 3.35 above the level of the Chicago city benchmark, over an area of approximately 120 hectares. The average height of the dunes did not exceed approximately 1.10. The eastern and southern regions were the lowest. The western part was the highest. The lowest waters observed date from the year 1847. The average water level of the lake in 1891 was 30 centimeters above the previous level. Finally, the level of the highest waters observed for the last 50 years had been 1.50 above the average level. By clearing the hilly parts and dredging the lagoons, the necessary excavation was obtained to fill in the low parts so that the ground under the buildings was at an altitude of about 1.50 above the benchmark, and the ground outside the buildings was raised to 1.8 meters. As for the terraces surrounding the palaces and those on the edge of the lake, they were raised from 3 meters to 3.7 meters above the benchmark. The surveys carried out at various points on the Jackson Park site showed that the geological constitution of the soil relative to the underground layers which composed it was substantially constant and uniform. The geological section of the site reserved for the buildings of the exposition was as follows. And so here we just have a small section indicating the layers and materials of each layer, but we'll head into the next section here. Test piles were driven, some to medium depths, others to such depths that their heads were level with the good ground. These piles were driven to refusal, and when they no longer sank appreciably under significant dynamic loads, it was concluded that the load limit should not be exceeded. The foundations on platforms made of 76mm thick boards were also tested. They were placed in the various locations reserved for the exhibition palaces, directly on the layer of sand, then were uniformly loaded with scrap metal up to 2.5 kilograms per square centimeter. These gradually placed loads caused settlements, which were carefully noted. To obtain greater safety, these loads were kept bare for several days, then transported to another platform to be tested. Under the maximum load, the settlements were very weak. They barely reached 10 millimeters. They were very uniform. Following these first settlements, a new overload of 2.5 kilograms per square centimeter was placed. The new settlements were then no longer appreciable. At points where the ground was marshy, the platforms placed on the sandy layer sank immediately by 30 to 90 centimeters, so almost a meter, under a load of 1 kilogram, 250 per square centimeter, and continued to decrease over the following days. It was agreed to use stilts for these locations on which wooden floors, similar to the previous platforms, would be placed in order to distribute the pressure evenly. In summary, it was thought that absolute safety could be achieved even for permanent buildings by allowing loads of 15 tons per pile and 12 tons per square meter of wooden raft. So here we just have an indication of plate 11 and 12 showing the types of foundations of the exhibition palaces. So I'll be sure to put those on screen while we read through the rest. Platform foundations consist of a series of floors of logs measuring 20 to 35 centimeters square. This series of increasingly spaced groups of logs rests on a platform of boards 50 to 76 millimeters thick. As for the piles, they measure from 25 to 30 centimeters in diameter and are spaced from 3 to 91 centimeters from axis to axis. The heads of these piles are fixed by iron pins to beams making up a floor of large planks immediately placed above. So after this section, we begin to see some of the depth that Mr. Krantz explores, measurements down to the millimeters, and dive into some of the processes used in the initial stages at the exposition. I can't really recall another document relating this much information and including the precision that is present in this technical review. And this is only the first few sections of the first volume, so we will most likely explore more in the future and hope that these provide some value. This is the information that I've really been searching for, the meat, the substance, and I understand that this is dense. However, I want to provide as much data as possible, allowing you to decipher a clearer picture of this event. So let's read into the details of the metal components at the exposition. Conditions for receiving the metal part. Wrought iron. All wrought iron had to be soft, malleable, and fibrous, of a uniform quality for each piece, tight, without blowholes, without cracks, without straws. No special processes or manufacturing arrangements were required. It was sufficient that the materials met the required conditions. Type of test, torsional strength, yield strength, and ductility were determined on a typical test. The experimental specimen had to be not less than 6 millimeters thick. It had to be taken across the full width of the part and then bent or flattened. Flat iron. Flat irons with a width of 20 centimeters had to withstand a tension of 33 kilograms per square millimeter. The elastic limit had to be not less than 18 kilograms per square millimeter, and the elongation greater than 12%. All flat irons over 60 centimeters wide had to withstand a tension of 18 kilograms per square millimeter. Those 60 to 90 centimeters wide had to have an elongation of less than 10%. Flat irons from 0.90 to 1 meter 20 wide should not stretch by more than 8%. Iron rivets. The shear force on the rivets should not exceed 6 kilograms per square millimeter. All iron rivets should be soft and malleable. A test piece of the same diameter as the rivet made with the same metal grip should be capable of being cold bent until the two sides could be brought into contact without giving any sign of cracking on the bent part. Bending tests. All bars had to be able to be bent through an angle of 180 degrees without showing any signs of breakage. The inside radius of the bend should be equal to the thickness of the piece. Hot bending. All flat irons, angle irons, had to be hot bent at right angles in the factories and had to be able to undergo this test abruptly without showing any sign of cracking or breaking. Number of cases. Unsure if I'm saying that correctly. Samples of flat irons or platforms, strips, had to be able to be cold bent at an angle of 90 degrees, the internal radius of curvature being equal to half the thickness of the piece, which, bent this way, had to show no sign of breakage. For each contract, 4 tests had to be made, plus 1 for each batch of 25,000 kilos of iron requested in addition. These tests had to be made free of charge by the contractor. If other tests were requested a second time, they were paid 25 francs each. Finally, if the contractor requested new tests, they were made at his own expense and under the supervision of the administration agent. The quality of the materials was determined as follows from the tests. The average of the results obtained by the testing of the samples was taken for each batch of metal bars. The batch from which the samples had been taken was to be accepted if the tests gave a suitable average. But if a sample gave a result lower than 4% of the required conditions, the bar to which the sample belonged was to be rejected, and this result entered into the average. If a piece had apparent defects, such as straws, blowholes, checks, it was set aside without testing. For any bar giving results 4% lower than those required, the contractor was to supply, without any compensation, 2 other bars which were subjected to the experiments. If, out of 10 tests, the 2 bars gave results 4% lower than those required, the entire batch was rejected. However, these lots were not to exceed 20 tons. Speed of verification. The tests had to be carried out quickly on the iron testing machines, and the quality of all the parts determined before they left the factory to go to the assembly site. All facilities had to be granted by the manufacturer to the agents carrying out these verifications. A weight variation in a rolled part exceeding 2.5% could lead to its rejection. And now we have a section labeled steels. No special process or means of production were required for the steels, provided that the pieces met all the imposed conditions. No steel was to contain more than 0.08 to 19% phosphorus. For every 3 ingots of each casting a sample bar was taken, it was to measure at least 0.010 millimeters in diameter and to have a length of at least 12 times the diameter. This test was the contractor's responsibility. The bars were to be melted and cooled to a uniform temperature. Tension test. The test bars examined had to have a tensile strength of 20 kilograms per square millimeter and a yield strength of at least half the tensile strength. The elongation had to be greater than 24% and the reduction in area at necking at least 40%. For the ductility test, the elongation was measured, after fracture, over a pitch length of 10 times, the smallest dimension of the piece to be tested. Number of test pieces. All specimens requested by the receiver to judge the good quality of the metal were at the charge of the industrialist, except, however, for the voltage tests, for which an average was agreed. The lot was also accepted if this average gave the results obtained. Steel rivets. The steel rivets had to be able to withstand a tension of 20 kilograms per square millimeter. Their elastic limit, their elongation, and their reduction in section were similar to those indicated previously. Now we have a section just labeled source. The cast iron had to present in its fracture a gray grain, tight, regular, and with tears, or tears. It had to be free of cracks, blowholes, cold drops, and other defects likely to alter its resistance and the clarity of the shapes of the pieces. It had to be both soft and tough, easy to cut with a chisel and a file, capable of being hammered back. It had to shrink little when cooling. All cast iron pieces had to be carefully cast on special molds, at the contractor's expense. After casting, they were carefully trimmed with a chisel and file. Steel from the Palace of Manufactures. The steels of this palace presented conditions significantly different from the previous steels. These steels had to be obtained by the Bessemer or Martin-Simons process. They had to be homogeneous and in no case contain more than 0.008 of phosphorus. The steels of the truss, except those of the rivets, had to have a resistance at break between 46 and 52 kilograms per square millimeter. The elongation at the moment of rupture had to be at least 16% on a 25 millimeter specimen, and the reduction in section at least 25% at the point of rupture. The elastic limit load at extension was not to reach 26 kilograms per square millimeter. Acceptance tests had to be carried out on each metal casing. The preserved test piece had to undergo torsion without disintegrating. This test was carried out on a mandrel, whose diameter had to be 3 times the half thickness of the sample. The test tube, then brought to cherry red, then thrown into the water marking 83 degrees, had to be able to undergo a second twist of 180 degrees without apparent disintegration. The steel for the rivets had to have a breaking strength between 39 kilograms and 43.5 kilograms per square millimeter. On a 20 millimeter long specimen, the elongation corresponding to the breaking extension had to be at least 25%, and the reduction in section at least 50%. The specimens had to be able to be reduced to a third of their original thickness without showing any signs of disintegration. Now, with that, I think we're going to close out this episode in particular. We will explore more of this first volume in an upcoming episode, as it delves into each building individually, and this will provide more detail and more nuance to this exposition as a whole. Overall, this technical review is additional evidence, however, quite strong evidence to push back on alternatives. This event has perplexed me for some time, and through these episodes and additional research into other areas of history is providing some much needed context for this event, and am interested in your comments about this technical review. I do believe, though, it's time that we explore more into the topic of construction materials used in this era. I'll leave you with this passage to ponder, as it will blend into that episode quite seamlessly. This one coming from a book that will surely be published on the channel soon, the New York Freer Stone Company. We read this small section on artificial stone. The attempt to supply the market with building stone by artificial processes is one of great antiquity. In parts of Europe and Africa, these processes are known to have been used for more than 1,000 years. The Barbary Moors have for many centuries possessed the art of making a most durable concrete, and when they overran Spain 700 years ago, introduced it to that country. There are now standing at Gibraltar a tower and several walls of buildings constructed wholly of this material, and believed to have been erected by the Moors during some former invasion, when they succeeded in gaining a foothold, but were unable permanently to maintain it. The antiquity of these relics cannot be less than 1,000 years, and still they endure, apparently unimpaired by the disintegrating touch of time and the storms which, for 10 centuries, have beaten upon them. It has been suggested, and not without reason, that the huge blocks which form the pyramids and puzzle the curious of modern times with the query, "Whence came we?" were not transported across the great desert, so many weary miles from distant quarries, but were made on the spot by some cunning process, the secret of which has perished with the wondrous race that builded them. This passage, this book, was published in 1871. 1871. Artificial stone is ancient in practice. The Romans arguably had some of the most durable recipes known in history. It was still practiced and industrialized into the 19th and early 20th century, and is now making a resurgence, yet again, with artificial stone or geopolymer industrial printers. Question it all, even the alternative theories. Let's see how sturdy those alternative foundations are when we dive into the materials of our past.